Hey, it's great to have you here today. And if you're new to Parker Hill, just want to let you know this is the final week in this series called My Perfect Family. And we've had a great time during this series. If you've missed any one of the previous 4 weeks, you can always go online and you can catch up there. But it's great to have you here today, whether you're joining us in Dixon City or Clark Summit or Wilkes-Barre or watching this message on the other side of a computer screen. So glad to have you with us as we wrap up this series. And today, as we bring this series in for a landing, I want us to think about some of the stuff that we're passing on to our kids. Or if you don't have kids, if you're not a parent, just maybe think about some of the things that we as a generation are collectively passing on to the next generation. I've been thinking about this lately because our family recently moved into a new house. And if you've ever moved, you know how that goes. You've got to kind of collect up all your stuff in the old house, put it on a truck, and then take it over to the new house. And I've been married for a while, got a couple of kids, and so we've acquired a lot of stuff over the years. And I don't know about you, but we've got this whole category of stuff that all we do is store it. It goes from one attic to the other attic, or now it goes from the attic to a basement, and we got all this stuff that we don't actually use. We just kind of store it, and then we move it, and then we store it again. And I was thinking about this as, we were moving all that stuff, and I thought to myself, someday I'm going to have to deal with all this stuff, or it's just going to get passed on to my kids, and then they're going to have to deal with it. Let me give you some examples, just so you know what I'm talking about. I'll show you some things that we've been storing and moving for a lot of years. I'll show you this. Let me show you a picture of what's inside this box. How many of you remember what this is on every campus? Just raise your hand. Yeah, these were very popular back in the 70s and 80s. This is a Precious Moments figurine. They're these little statues with very round faces and teardrop eyes, and they look so incredibly, sickeningly sweet. And we have about 50 of these in a box. They've been stored in our attic for about 25 years, and now they're being stored in our basement. So someday, we're going to pass those off to our kids. And then one other thing that I found here was my high school diploma. And if you're reading that right now, you're probably thinking, does that say what I think it says? And yes, I did graduate from Sandwich High School. And no, it is not a training school for Subway restaurants. I actually lived in Sandwich, Illinois at the time. So someday my kids will get that. I also, had this season in my life when I was really into horses and Western style clothing. So I also had this belt buckle, and I haven't worn this belt buckle in 30 years, but I still have it and I still store it. And so someday I guess it's just going to get passed down to my kids, and I'm sure my daughters are going to be thrilled to have that big old belt buckle. And then of course I've got probably 25 of these. And I'll bet there's some really great family memories on these VHS tapes, but I wouldn't know if there were or not, because even though I saved the tapes, I did not save a VCR for some reason. But that's okay. Someday my kids are going to deal with that as well. So, I've got all this stuff, and maybe you do too, all this stuff that we acquire over a period of time. And, if I don't deal with this stuff that I picked up along the way, then someday my kids are going to have to deal with it. And they're going to sell it, or they're going to give it away, or maybe they'll hang on to it and pass it on to their kids as well. But here's what I know about all of us. We're all passing stuff on to our kids, whether they want it or not. And I'm not just talking about physical things. I'm talking about things like values and attitudes and character and habits and faith, or the lack of faith. And sometimes we pass on some really, really good things to our kids, and sometimes we pass on some not so good things to our kids. Some of you might be passing on to your kids, a critical spirit, because your default response is to see the worst in every situation, or see the worst in every person, and your kids pick up on that, and so you're passing on a critical spirit. Some of you as parents, you might pass on your anxiety and your fear. If you've got a 10-year-old who's got the WebMD app on her cell phone and she's checking it every day to see what symptoms are, she probably got that from you. Okay, just saying. Maybe some of you are passing on greed to your kids, because your kids, they see how lavishly you spend on yourself, but then when it comes to giving to other people or advancing God's kingdom with your resources, they see how tight-fisted you are. And so what you're passing on is you're passing on greed. And there are a lot of bad things we can pass on, but I know this as well. A lot of you, because I see you, a lot of you are passing on some really, really good things, like compassion and integrity and generosity and authentic faith. So here's the question. What are you passing on to your kids? And not just your kids, but also your grandkids and your great-grandkids. Because as we talk about this today, I want to kind of stretch your thinking about your family. Because, if I were to tell you about my family, or you were to tell me about your family, when we think of family, oftentimes we think of just our immediate family because we think like Westerners, right? But in many cultures, they think of family more broadly. And if you were to say to somebody in another culture, tell me about your family, they wouldn't just tell you about, their spouse and their kids. They would start maybe with their great-grandfather and then talk about their grandfather and their father, and then they would talk about their kids, and then maybe talk about their hopes and dreams for future generations. And in many cultures, they see family through a much bigger lens, and they see a much bigger picture. And that was true in Bible culture as well, in the Jewish culture. They really saw family more in terms of generations. I'll give you a couple examples of this. Deuteronomy chapter 6. In fact, we're going to keep coming back to this passage. If you want to open up your Bible to this or bring it up on your phone or mobile device, Deuteronomy 6. And I'll tell you the context here. This is the 5th book of the Bible, Deuteronomy. And the history behind this is this. The people of Israel had been freed from slavery in Egypt. Moses had led them on this incredible journey through the wilderness, and now they're about to enter the Promised Land. And the book of Deuteronomy is essentially Moses' final goodbye to the people. And he tells them, kind of reminds them of what it will take for them to prosper spiritually and to prosper physically in this land that God is about to give to them. And so Deuteronomy chapter 6, here's how it begins. It says, "These are the commands and decrees and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan River to possess, so that," and listen to this, "so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life." And so Moses says to the people of Israel, he says, listen, here's my hope for you. Here's my prayer for you, that first of all, you will follow God with all your heart. But then not just that your kids will also, your children will follow God with all of their hearts. And not just even that, but your children's children will follow God with all their hearts. Because they would look at family across generations, and they would have this great vision for what could be passed on from generation to generation. So that's Deuteronomy chapter 6. Let me give you one more example. This is in Psalm 78. Now, in case you're new to the Bible and new to church, the book of Psalms is a collection of writings, poetry, written by some of the Jewish leaders in that time. And these would be recited, or else they would be set to music and they would be sung. And so these were the collective expressions of the community of the Jewish people. And in Psalm 78, it says this, similar idea. It says, "We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel for this reason, which he commanded our ancestors to," listen to this, "teach their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children as well." So when they thought of family, they didn't just think of the here and now. They thought of generations, and they thought of what they would pass down to the coming generations. And as you think about your family today, I want you to think in those terms as well. Don't just think in terms of months or years or getting your kids out of the house when they're 21 or whatever it might be. Think in terms of generations. Think about how our choices right now, the things we do and the things that we say, could potentially have a ripple effect across decades of time and generations of our descendants. Now, before I go any further, let me just say this, that today's message isn't just for parents. And I want to say that very clearly because I know not everybody hearing this message is a parent. But it is for all of us, because I think all of us have a part to play in shaping the next generation, and we need to understand that. And some of you have an obvious part to play in shaping the next generation, because you can do that as a grandparent, or you can do that as an aunt or an uncle. Others of you can have an opportunity to shape the next generation by coming alongside a single parent and mentoring a child, or maybe taking in a foster care child. Many of you have huge influence in the next generation because you volunteer in our kids ministry, or you volunteer in our student ministry. And I got to tell you, I praise God for you guys every day for the difference that you're making. But my point is this: we can all find opportunities to influence the next generation, even if we're not parents, and we should look for those opportunities. Like any of us who are followers of Christ, we should care about that, because the future of our church depends on it. The future of our community depends on it. The future of our nation depends on it. And if I could, kind of take this entire message and summarize it in one big idea, I would give you this idea. I'm not even sure where I heard this from years ago, but I thought it was profound. That children are the living messages we send to a time we will not see. They're living messages we send to a time we will not see. See, that's thinking generationally. And the question is, what kind of messages are we going to send? Now, let me tell you the challenge in all of this. Here's the challenge. We live in a world, and we are surrounded by a culture that is constantly working against us. And if we are not diligent, there's this drift that happens from generation to generation. There's this spiritual and moral decay that can set in so easily if we're not diligent. In fact, the word I would use to describe this is the word entropy. May not be a word that you hear very much, but it's a word that explains a lot of things in this world, and entropy happens in a lot of places. It's an idea that's loosely based on the second law of thermodynamics. You don't even care about that, but here's the definition. Without a constant input of energy, all things move toward disorder. Isn't that true? Isn't that just true of life? In fact, let me prove it to you. I'll give you some examples, okay, of how entropy works in everyday life. And this is kind of an interactive exercise. I'm going to read a statement, and then you can just, on every campus, you can holler out the answer that goes in the blank, okay? So here we go. First one. This is entropy. If I don't pay attention to my garden, it will eventually be filled with weeds. Yes. Okay, that's entropy. Here's another one, another example of this. If I don't maintain my piano, it will eventually be out of tune. Yeah, very good. Okay, you're getting the idea. That's entropy. Let me give you one more. Number 3. If I don't color my hair, it will eventually turn gray, and I will look distinguished is the word I was looking for here, distinguished, okay? Here's my point. The same thing that happens with, pianos and gardens and your hair, that same process can take place generationally, this process of entropy. If we are not diligent, then the forces of our culture will cause this shift, this decay to occur over generations. And, so many of us complain about, the culture we live in today, the spiritual and moral state of our culture, and we ask ourselves, how did it get this way? I'll tell you how it got this way. Very slowly, one generation at a time. And here's my observation. My observation is this, that in many families, it only takes about 3 generations to go from a strong, authentic faith to a faith that is barely existent at all. And it's a pretty predictable pattern that you can see unfold. In fact, let me just try to illustrate it for you with these 3 chairs. Okay, let me start over here with this chair, and this is the chair that I would call commitment. This person is the person who has a strong faith, and they've got a strong moral compass, and they don't look at God as some distant entity or some theoretical figure. They have an authentic relationship with God that guides them every day of their lives. It's a defining reality for them. That's this chair that I would call commitment. This second chair, let's call this second chair compromise. This is a person who has a relationship with God. They've taken on the faith of their parents, but it's been watered down a little bit. It's not nearly as important to them. They have a relationship with God, but it's not really a defining reality of their lives because there's so many other things that just seem so much more important. And then we'll call this third chair complacency. This would be the person who doesn't really care all that much at all about spiritual realities. I mean, they're not anti-God, they're not anti-faith, and they kind of respect the faith and the values of previous generations, but they walked away from it years ago. And see, in this culture that we live in, there's this constant drift. If we're not diligent, if we're not careful in our family, I mean our big family, if we're not careful, there's this drift from commitment to compromise to complacency that can take place. And it's a pretty predictable, inescapable pattern. In fact, let me kind of tease that out a little bit more, because as that process unfolds, you see over generations a changing worldview, a different way of looking at life. Let me give you 4 examples. Like the person who occupies this chair, the chair we call commitment, when they think about the church, they would say this: the church is God's community. In other words, this person doesn't see the church as just an organization or an hour on Sunday or a building somewhere. This person would say, the church is God's redeemed people called together on a mission in this world to advance God's kingdom. And I am joyfully a part of that, God's community. But the person in the second chair that we're calling compromise, they would look at the church and they would say, the church to me is kind of like a club. Like I've got the membership and I go every so often, and it feels good to be part of it, kind of like a fitness club membership or a health club membership. You get that membership and you feel good about it, and every so often, you realize you're getting out of shape and you got to go back to the club, and so you get consistent about it again, and then you drift off. But the club's always there if you want to go back. Compromise. But then the third chair that we're calling complacency, they would look at the church and say, the church is it's a custom. It's a pretty good custom, and every Easter, every Christmas, or when grandma comes into town, it's a nice custom, but not really relevant to my life. There's a drift. Or think about something else. Think about your attitude and your perspective of the Bible. This person in chair number 1 would say, I submit to the Bible. This is the person who would say, I believe that the words of Scripture are the very breath of God. And this would be the person who seeks to study and understand the principles of Scripture and then, live their life accordingly, knowing that God's wisdom is always best. And this was the person who says, I submit to the Bible. The person in the second chair here, this is the person who would say, I appreciate the Bible. I appreciate it, and especially things like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. I appreciate the Bible, but this is the person who, will kind of pick and choose what parts of the Bible they appreciate and what they don't. And then the person in this last chair that we call complacency, this is the person who would say, I own a Bible. I have one somewhere. Got one for our wedding. I'm not sure where it is, but I know we get it out whenever Mom comes and dust it off, and we put it on the coffee table. There's a drift that happens. Think about marriage, okay? The person who occupies this chair, what we call the chair of commitment, this person would say marriage is a covenant. Meaning this, my marriage is a covenant not just between me and my spouse, but between me and God. And so in order to honor that covenant I've made with God, I'm going to honor my marriage vows. And this is the person who will fight for their marriage to keep it healthy. And this is the person who does not consider divorce except in very narrow circumstances because they see marriage as a covenant. But then the person in this chair that we're calling, compromise, this person would say, marriage is a contract. It's a contract between me and my spouse, and as long as they live up to their end of the contract, then I'll continue. But if they're not holding up their end of the bargain, I see no reason why I should hold up my end of the bargain, because it's kind of this mutual agreement just between us. It's a contract. But then complacency would say marriage is a convenience that many people in our culture don't even choose anymore today. But even when many people do get married, they would say marriage is as long as we both shall love. And so if I fall out of love, or if somebody more interesting comes along, then, I'm kind of out of here. Because marriage, it's a convenience. And there's, this drift that happens culturally from generation to generation. One more, parenting. The person who sits in this chair, the chair that we're calling commitment, they would say, my goal as a parent is to raise godly kids. I mean, I want my kids to do well in life. I want them to get a great education. I want them to succeed in life. But more important than any of that is that my kids are going to love God and love others, and they're going to advance His kingdom in this world. But then there's the person in the second chair. The person in the second chair would say, you know what, when it comes to parenting, my goal is to raise good kids. I want my kids to grow up and stay out of trouble and stay off drugs and, not end up in jail and marry a nice person, get a decent job, settle down, recycle, things like that, right? Good kids, that's what I want. But then the third chair, what we're calling complacency, this person would say, my goal is to raise not godly kids, and good, that's okay, but my goal is to raise successful kids. And so the message their kids hear is, I'm not all that concerned about your spiritual life, and I'm not even all that concerned about your moral life. Just, be careful and use protection, all that stuff. But here's what I'm concerned about. You better get good grades, and you better get a great job, and you better succeed in life. It doesn't matter who you step on, because that's what's really important. Do you see the shift, the decay, the drift that I've just illustrated? I think we see this all throughout our culture. But here's what I want you to understand. That is not God's goal for your legacy if you're a follower of Christ. That is not God's goal for your family. What is the goal? Let me go back to Deuteronomy 6. That you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live by keeping all His decrees. Here's the goal. That I would be marked by my commitment to God. And that my children would be marked by their commitment to God. And that my grandchildren would be marked by their commitment to God. That I would leave a legacy that spans generations, because children are the living messages that we send to a time that we will not see. And so we want to send a good message. So how do we make that happen? How do we resist this natural decay, this natural drift? How do we stop that from happening? And we can't guarantee anything. We talked about that last week. We don't have control over our kids. We only have influence. But what can we do to stack the deck in our favor? Let me go back again to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and I just want to draw out of this passage, as we continue reading the words of Moses, 3 things that our kids need. Number 1 is this. Our kids need parents who live this. Here's what I mean by that. You cannot impart what you do not possess. And if you try to pass something on to your kids that you don't live up to yourself, that you don't believe in your heart, they're going to sniff that out. They're going to see it every single time, and they're not going to buy it. Listen to what Moses goes on to say here in Deuteronomy chapter 6. He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Then he says this, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts." 4th time he's used that word. Then he says, impress them on your children. So the first thing we have to do before we try to pass anything on is we have to live it. Because here's the thing, if our kids have to choose between what they hear from our lips and what they see in our lives, they're going to choose every time what they see in our lives. I guarantee it. So you got to live this, first of all. There was an interesting survey that was done a few years ago by Fuller Theological Seminary about the influence of a parent's example. And they discovered this: when both parents are faithful and active in their church, 93% of their children continue in the faith. They don't walk away. When even just one parent is faithful and active, 73% of their children continue in their faith. But listen to this. In families where parents attend church only occasionally, interpreted that would mean whenever their kids' softball team isn't playing, 6% of their children continue in their faith. So, here's where you got to start. in the whole parenting thing and the whole influencing the next generation, what chair are you sitting in? Because here's the thing. I don't care what your parents passed down to you. I don't care what baggage, what junk you got from them. You were not born a loser. You were not born a winner, but you were born a chooser, and you've got to make a choice. And I think you've got to begin by making a choice that says, you know what, I'm going to live right here. I'm going to sit in the chair of commitment. Because here's the deal. If you live here, you sit in the chair of compromise, you will never raise kids that rise to this level. In fact, you won't even raise kids who rise to this level, because they're going to see the inauthenticity of your faith, and they're going to walk away from that knowing it's hypocrisy, and they're just going to end up here. So the question you got to start with is, what chair are you in? Where are you going to sit? Where are you going to live? What kind of faith are you going to have? Because what our kids need more than anything else is they need parents who live this. Second thing our kids need is this. They need parents who own this. Here's what I mean by that. I'm a parent, and I've discovered that there are many areas of our kids' lives where we kind of delegate their development to other people. Like I drop my daughter off at school every day so that they can give her a good education. And I took my daughter to dance lessons so that she could learn ballet. And, I take my daughter to the dentist so that he can take care of her teeth. I even paid for my older daughter to get professional driving lessons to get her license, because I thought that would go a little bit better than her and I doing it. And there's so many areas of life as parents where we can delegate to other people. But the problem is we begin to take that approach with our kids' hearts, with their spiritual journey. And we say, you know what? Let's leave that up to the church, to the people there at the church. That's their job. They know how to do that stuff, right? But let me tell you this. You need the church, and the church needs to partner with families, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. The church is very important as a component in all of this, but there is one responsibility, if you're a parent, that you can never, ever delegate to anyone else, and that's your responsibility for your child's faith, for their spiritual well-being. Nobody else can do that for you. Listen to what Moses goes on to say here. He says, these commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Remember, it all starts there. You got to live it. Then he says, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. Do you see what's being described here? Do you see the picture? You see parents engaging in spiritual conversations with their kids in the everyday flow of life, praying together, talking together, learning together. This is describing a faith that is not confined to a church building in an hour on Sunday. This is describing a faith that is woven throughout the life of a family, led by the parents and especially the father. And I don't know what that means for you. Maybe it means that you read the Bible with your kids on a regular basis. Maybe it means you pray with them at night when you tuck them in. Maybe it means that you download, the Bible app for kids. Maybe it simply means you take advantage of all those teachable moments as you spend time walking through life and sitting down at dinner and laying down with them at bedtime, and you take advantage of those conversations and those teachable moments to connect the everyday events of life to the principles of Scripture and God's truth for them. So what do our kids need if we're going to avoid the drift? Parents who live this, parents who own this, and third, parents who share this. Here's what I mean by that. Our kids need parents who are smart enough to realize that they cannot raise great kids on their own. And let me tell you, if we're going to raise kids that live in this chair, the chair of commitment, as parents, I believe we can't do that on our own. We have to make an intentional commitment to have our families and our children deeply involved in the life of a community of believers. We can't do it alone. We got to share the responsibility with others. Let me go back to Psalm 78 and just read through this one more time. Remember, this was what the people of Israel would read or sing together collectively. They said, we will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, His power and the wonders He has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which He commanded our ancestors to teach their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. And I want you to remember something. This was not a vow that parents made in the privacy of their own home. This was a song. This was something that the people of Israel as a community would recite together. This was their collective declaration because they recognized that no matter how old they were and whether or not they had kids, they recognized that they had this collective responsibility to nurture the next generation. And I think the same is true today. We as parents need to raise our kids within a community of believers who can help us point them in the right direction. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that and what I don't mean by that. This is kind of a rabbit trail, but I think it's an important one. What I don't mean by that is this: bring your kids to church and have them sit with you in this church service. I don't want you to do that, and that may sound surprising to you. But I believe that this adult service on every campus, this environment, is not the best environment for your kids to grow spiritually. They need to be in a group with kids their own age, with material that's engaging to them on their level, and with an adult leader or leaders who can pour into them and mentor them. And many of you may not even know this, but on every campus, we have got incredibly engaging, creative programs for kids and for students. And that's the best place for your kids. It really is. I think you're ripping them off if you keep them here in big church with you. I really mean that. And if you have any fears about security, you need to know that all of our volunteers have to go through an FBI background check, and they always work in teams of 2. Nobody is alone. It's a very secure, very creative environment, and I just want to encourage you to take advantage of that. I can tell you in the lives of my own kids, that has paid off big time. Now, when they get in high school, we invite them back in to be part of this here, but middle school and younger, man, let me just encourage you to get them in an age-appropriate group. It's going to be the best thing for them. And another rabbit trail, kind of as an aside, if you do have kids in here with you, and they start to get a little bit rambunctious, or they cry a little bit, or get a little bit restless, let me encourage you, because I'm up front, I see this a lot, let me encourage you just to take them out and find one of our ushers, because we've got a room where you can watch a video feed of the message, and they're free to cry or move around, and that'll be less stressful for you and for the people around you, because as much as we love your kids, and we do love your kids, that's why we spend so much money and staff on helping them grow spiritually. As much as we love your kids, we don't want your kids to be a distraction to somebody who needs to hear from God. So please do that for me. That's an aside. But all that to say, as parents, we got to make it a priority to have our kids engaged in a community of believers and in the right environment. And I'll tell you why that is. Here's what happens. As your kids get older, they will start seeking affirmation and advice and approval from people other than you. And I can tell you this, I got a 19-year-old and a 15-year-old. I've seen this in the lives of my own kids. The older they get, the more they tend to listen to people other than me and their mom. It's hard, but it's the way life goes. And so Debbie and I have been very intentional over the years to make sure our kids are involved in settings where they can build relationships with people, peers and small group leaders and mentors, build relationships with people who will say the same things that we're saying, but in a little bit different way. And I got to tell you, I am the biggest cheerleader of our kids' ministries and our student ministries, because we as a family feel incredibly blessed by the volunteers and the small group leaders and the staff who've come alongside of our kids and helped us in the process of passing on our faith. And I want you to think about something. I want you to think about something, because this is important for us collectively as a church. This weekend, we will have somewhere around 500 kids, birth through middle school, walk in the doors of one of our campuses. Like every Sunday, we have the opportunity to pour into the hearts of the next generation and possibly prevent the drift that we've talked about, and partner with families in helping them to raise up a generation of young people who are committed to their faith. So what part are you playing in that? Because I think we all need to feel the weight of that responsibility. Let me say this, if you're single or if you're married and you don't have kids yet, I think one of the best things you can do is serve in our children's ministries. I'll tell you why. Number one, you get to start investing now in the next generation. And number two, you get some practice for kids that you may have someday. It's kind of like taking driver's ed before you get out into rush hour, right? And listen, if you're a single young lady, I mean, what better place to find a guy than somebody who's serving already in our children's ministries? I'll get in trouble for saying that, but I'll just throw that in there as well. Maybe you've already raised your kids, and I hear this all the time. Yeah, I put my time in. I raised my kids. You know what that means? That means you have experience that you can pass on to the next generation. You should invest in the next generation of kids, even if your kids are grown. Or maybe you don't have kids and you wish you could, and that disappointment in your heart is so painful. Listen, maybe a small way to compensate for that disappointment that you feel is just to find a single parent or to find a foster kid or get involved in ministry here and pour into the next generation somehow. Why? Why do we need to do that? Let me tell you one more time. Again, children are the living messages we send to a time we will not see, and we got to think about this not in terms of months or years, but in terms of generations. And what message are we going to send ahead in time for the sake of our church and our community and even our nation?